The evening air hung heavy with humidity as Federal Judge Thomas Mitchell drove home from the courthouse. His day had stretched longer than expected, the stack of case files finally conquered, just as the building emptied and the cleaning staff began their nightly rounds. At 58 years old, Thomas had dedicated over 25 years of his life to upholding justice in the federal courts, earning respect from colleagues and community members alike. The headlights of his modest sedan cut through the darkness as he navigated the familiar streets toward home. His mind drifted to the dinner waiting in the refrigerator and the weekend plans with his grandchildren. A flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted him from his thoughts. Thomas checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding, perhaps a taillight issue. He signaled and pulled to the curb, following the procedure he'd advised countless others to follow in similar situations. As he waited for the officer to approach, he reached for his wallet, retrieving both his driver's license and his judicial identification. The knock on his window came with unnecessary force. Thomas pressed the button to lower it, offering a polite smile to the uniformed figure standing outside. "Good evening, officer," he said calmly. "Officer." Ryan Daniels didn't return the greeting. His flashlight beam swept across Thomas's face, then through the interior of the car. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone clipped and cold. Thomas handed over his license along with his judicial credentials. "I believe everything is in order, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" Officer Daniels barely glanced at the judicial ID before focusing on the driver's license. "You failed to come to a complete stop at the intersection back there." Thomas frowned slightly. He was certain he had stopped properly at every intersection. "I respectfully disagree, officer. I made complete stops at all intersections." Something in Daniels's demeanor shifted. His posture stiffened, and his expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." "I don't believe that's necessary for a minor traffic violation," Thomas replied, maintaining his composure despite the growing tension. "I've identified myself as a federal judge." "I don't care if you're the president," Daniels interrupted, his voice rising. "I said get out of the car, now." A young woman walking her dog across the street slowed her pace, noticing the escalating situation. She pulled her phone from her pocket and began recording, a habit many had developed in recent years during police encounters. Thomas took a deep breath and slowly opened his door. He'd presided over enough cases involving police conduct to know that remaining calm was essential. "I'm complying, officer," he said clearly, stepping onto the pavement. "But I want to note that I believe this detention is unwarranted." Without warning, Officer Daniels grabbed Thomas by the arm, spinning him around and pushing him against the car. The judge's cheek pressed against the cool metal of his vehicle as his arms were wrenched behind his back. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, shock evident in his voice. "This is completely unnecessary." "Stop resisting," Daniels barked, though Thomas had offered no resistance. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Thomas's wrists as Daniels secured them with unnecessary tightness. By now, 2 more bystanders had stopped to witness the scene unfolding. Before them, phones raised to capture the incident. "Officer, please," Thomas said, his dignified voice steady despite the humiliation of being handcuffed on a public street. "I've served on the federal bench for 25 years. There must be some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding here is you thinking your job matters to me," Daniels replied, roughly patting down Thomas's sides. "Everyone thinks they're special. Everyone thinks the rules don't apply to them." Thomas stood in silent dignity as the officer continued his search, finding nothing but a cell phone and a set of house keys. The reality of the situation hit him in waves. After decades of serving justice, he was being treated like a common criminal for no apparent reason. "Am I under arrest?" Thomas finally asked. "If so, I'd like to know the charges." "You're being detained," Daniels responded, leading him toward the patrol car. "Failure to comply with an officer's orders. We'll see about additional charges at the station." As Thomas was guided into the back seat of the police cruiser, his judicial robe still hanging in the back of his own car, he caught sight of at least 5 people recording the incident. Their expressions ranged from concern to outrage. "My name "Is Thomas Mitchell?" he called out clearly. "I'm a federal judge being detained without cause. Please contact the courthouse." Officer Daniels slammed the door shut, cutting off further communication with the growing crowd of witnesses. Thomas sat in the cramped back seat, the handcuffs digging painfully into his wrists, and watched through the window as Daniels spoke into his radio, occasionally glancing back at him with what seemed like satisfaction. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving Thomas's vehicle parked on the street. As they drove through the city streets, Thomas's mind raced with thoughts of precedents and legal procedures. But beneath it all was a simpler, more human question. Why was this happening to him? At 58, Thomas had experienced his share of discrimination, from subtle slights to outright hostility. He had worked twice as hard to achieve his position, navigating barriers that many of his colleagues never faced. He had thought, perhaps naively, that his position as a federal judge would shield him from such treatment. The handcuffs cutting into his wrists proved otherwise. The police station loomed ahead, its lights harsh against the night sky. As the car came to a stop, Thomas straightened his shoulders and prepared himself for what would come next. He knew the system from the inside had spent his career ensuring its fairness. Now he was about to experience it from a very different perspective. Officer Daniels opened the door and roughly helped Thomas out of the vehicle. As they walked toward the station entrance, Thomas noted the surprised expressions of several officers who clearly recognized him. None stepped forward to intervene. "This is Federal Judge Mitchell," Daniels announced as they entered the processing area, his tone suggesting he'd brought in a common troublemaker rather than a respected jurist. "Needs to be processed for failure to comply and resisting." A desk. Sergeant looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. "Judge Mitchell? There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Daniels insisted. "The law applies to everyone." As Thomas stood there, still handcuffed and now the center of attention in a police station where he had often been welcomed with respect, he realized that the night's events were far from over. Something more was happening here. Something that would test not just his patience and dignity, but perhaps the very system he had sworn to uphold. What Thomas couldn't know, as he was led toward the processing desk, was that a video of his arrest was already spreading across social media, about to ignite a firestorm that would change everything. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Judge Thomas Mitchell stood at the processing desk, his wrists still bound by uncomfortably tight handcuffs. The night shift officers moved through their routines, but their sideways glances betrayed their recognition of the distinguished federal judge now being processed like any other suspect. "Name?" asked the booking officer, a heavy-set man with graying temples who couldn't quite meet Thomas's eyes. "Judge Thomas Mitchell, Federal District Court," Thomas replied calmly, his deep voice carrying across the room. Several officers looked up, then quickly away. Officer Daniels stood close by, arms crossed. "Just put Thomas Mitchell. Title doesn't matter here." The booking officer hesitated, then typed the full title. Small acts of rebellion, Thomas thought. Not everyone agreed with what was happening. "Empty your pockets, please," the officer continued, pushing a plastic bin across the counter. "My hands are still restrained," Thomas said evenly, "and I've already been searched by Officer Daniels during my arrest." Daniels stepped forward. "Detention, not arrest. There's a difference, counselor." His emphasis on the last word dripped with sarcasm. The booking officer signaled to another officer, who approached with a key to remove the handcuffs. As the metal bracelets came off, Thomas rubbed his wrists, noting the red marks where they had dug into his skin. "Thank you," he said, maintaining his composure as he emptied his pockets, wallet, handkerchief, loose change. Nothing remarkable, nothing threatening. "Charges?" the booking officer asked Daniels without looking up. "Failure to comply with an officer's lawful orders, resisting detention, disorderly conduct," Daniels rattled off. Each charge more serious than the last, each one further from the truth of what had happened. Thomas couldn't stay silent. "Those charges are completely unfounded. I complied with all reasonable requests." There are multiple witnesses and likely video evidence of the entire interaction. Save it for court, Daniels snapped. A younger officer approached, speaking quietly to the booking officer, who frowned and then nodded. Sir, he addressed Thomas, you're entitled to a phone call. I'd like to contact Court Administrator Patricia Wilson, Thomas replied. Her number should be in the courthouse directory. No special treatment, Daniels interrupted. He can call his lawyer like anyone else. The booking officer looked uncomfortable. Standard procedure allows detainees to contact anyone of their choosing for their call. Thomas was led to a phone mounted on the wall. He dialed Patricia's home number from memory, hoping she would be home at this late hour. After 4 rings, her sleepy voice answered. Patricia, it's Thomas Mitchell, he said, keeping his voice steady. I apologize for calling so late, but I've been detained by police under questionable circumstances. I'm at the Central Precinct. The shock in her voice was evident. Judge Mitchell? What on earth? I'll make some calls right away. Are you all right? Physically, yes, he replied, conscious of the officers within earshot. The situation is unusual. I'd appreciate your assistance in sorting this out. After hanging up, Thomas was photographed, fingerprinted, and led to a holding cell. The cell already contained 2 other occupants, a young man who appeared to be sleeping off intoxication, and an older man sitting quietly in the corner. The cell door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing in the small space. Thomas sat on the vacant bench, his back straight, his expression neutral despite the churning in his stomach. In 30 years of legal practice, he had visited many jails and prisons, but always with the authority to leave whenever he wished. The reality of confinement, even temporary, was something altogether different. Rough night? The older man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Thomas nodded. You could say that. What did they get you for? Allegedly failing to make a complete stop at an intersection, Thomas replied, though the charges seemed to have multiplied since then. The man chuckled without humor. Funny how that happens. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, trying to make sense of the evening's events. A minor traffic stop, if there had been a valid reason, for one at all, had escalated into detention on multiple charges. Why? The question kept circling in his mind. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the police station, the video of his detention was spreading rapidly across social media platforms. The young woman who had first started recording had posted it with the caption, "Just witnessed a respected black federal judge handcuffed and arrested for nothing. This is Judge Thomas Mitchell being mistreated by police. Share widely." And people were sharing. By midnight, the video had been viewed over 50,000 times. Local news organizations had picked it up, and reporters were already gathering outside the police station, demanding comments from officials. Inside the holding cell, Thomas had no idea of the storm brewing outside. He sat quietly, mentally reviewing the events that had led him here, looking for some explanation. He had encountered Officer Daniels before, but couldn't place where or when. The hours crawled by. The intoxicated young man woke briefly, groaned, and went back to sleep. The older man dozed off sitting up. Thomas remained awake, his mind too active for sleep. Around 3 a.m., the cell door opened and a senior officer, a captain by his insignia, appeared. "Judge Mitchell," he said, his tone respectful. "If you could come with me, please." Thomas stood, nodding goodbye to the older man who had raised his head at the disturbance. "Good luck," the man whispered. Thomas followed the captain to a small office away from the holding cells. Inside, a woman in a suit stood as they entered. "Judge Mitchell, I'm Lieutenant Rosario from Internal Affairs," she said, extending her hand. "I want to personally apologize for what's happened tonight." Thomas shook her hand but remained cautious. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant. May I ask what prompted this change in treatment?" The captain and lieutenant exchanged glances. "Sir, the video of your detention has gone viral," the captain explained. "The chief has been contacted by the mayor, several news outlets, and the Bar Association. We're conducting an immediate review of the incident." Lieutenant Rosario added, "We've also received calls from multiple officers within the department, expressing concerns about Officer Daniels's conduct. Thomas absorbed this information. I see. And the charges? Being reviewed, the captain said quickly. The chief has authorized your immediate release on your own recognizance. Thomas nodded, slowly. I appreciate that. However, I want to be clear that I expect a full investigation, not just because of who I am, but because no citizen should experience what I experienced tonight. As they continued discussing next steps across town, investigative journalists were already digging into Officer Daniels's history. What they were finding would shock even those accustomed to stories of police misconduct. Records of complaints buried, incidents of excessive force dismissed, and a pattern of targeting specific groups. But most significantly, they uncovered court transcripts from just 3 weeks earlier, where Judge Mitchell had harshly criticized the police department for procedural violations in a high-profile case, a case where Officer Daniels had been the arresting officer. The ruling had overturned the conviction and led to an official reprimand in Daniels' file. The connection was becoming clear. This hadn't been a random traffic stop that spiraled out of control. It had been something far more troubling, a deliberate attempt at intimidation by a police officer with a grudge. As the night gave way to dawn, Judge Mitchell was finally released from the police station. Stepping outside, he was surprised to find a crowd of supporters, reporters, and cameras waiting. The story had already grown far beyond a simple detention. It had become a flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about power, justice, and accountability. What no one knew yet was how Thomas Mitchell would respond, and how his response would change everything. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Thomas Mitchell's home as he sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept since his release from the police station 3 hours earlier. The events of the night kept replaying in his mind. The flashing lights, the harsh voice of Officer Daniels, the cold metal of handcuffs against his wrists. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Colleagues, friends, community leaders, and reporters were all trying to reach him. The video of his detention had spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the city and beyond. Thomas had watched it once, seeing himself pushed against his car, handcuffed despite his calm compliance, and couldn't bring himself to view it again. A gentle knock on the door broke his thoughts. His daughter Lisa stood there, concern etched across her face. She had driven over immediately after seeing the news. "Dad," she said, crossing the room to embrace him. "Are you okay? I've been trying to call you all morning." Thomas returned her hug, drawing strength from her presence. "I'm all right, just processing everything." Lisa pulled back, examining her father's face. At 34, she had inherited his strong sense of justice, becoming a civil rights attorney. "This is outrageous. The department is trying to spin it as a misunderstanding, but that video tells a different story." Thomas nodded slowly. It wasn't a misunderstanding. He moved to his study where Lisa followed. On his desk lay stacks of case files, meticulous as always. He pulled one from a drawer and opened it. 3 weeks ago, I overturned a conviction in a drug possession case, he explained. The arresting officer had conducted an illegal search. No warrant, no probable cause. I had to throw out all the evidence and release the defendant. Lisa leaned closer. "Let me guess. The arresting officer was Daniels?" "Officer Ryan Daniels," Thomas confirmed. "I also recommended a formal reprimand and suggested the department review his other cases for similar misconduct." Understanding dawned on Lisa's face. "So last night wasn't random?" "I don't believe it was," Thomas said quietly. His phone rang again. "Court Administrator Patricia Wilson," he answered, putting it on speaker. "Thomas, have you seen the news this morning?" Patricia asked without preamble. "Not yet," he admitted. "Channel 7 just ran a special report on Officer Daniels. They've uncovered at least 7 formal complaints against him in the past 3 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, falsifying reports. All buried or dismissed." Thomas and Lisa exchanged looks. "There's more," Patricia continued. "They've connected the dots to your ruling last month. The reporter is calling it a clear case of targeted intimidation by a rogue officer. The police chief has scheduled a press conference for noon. After ending the call, Thomas sat in silence for a moment, then stood with newfound resolve. I need to address this, not just as the victim of misconduct, but as a judge who took an oath to uphold justice. By 11 o'clock, the Mitchell household had become a hub of activity. Thomas's longtime friend and fellow judge, Robert Chen, had arrived to offer support. Court staff had sent over fresh clothes and his spare robes. Thomas's younger brother, William, came bearing groceries and his unwavering loyalty. The community is behind you, William told him. People are gathering outside the courthouse. They're calling for Daniels to be fired and charged. Thomas shook his head. This isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allowed him to operate this way for years. As noon approached, Thomas watched the police chief's press conference on television. The chief, looking uncomfortable and sleep-deprived, announced Officer Daniels' immediate suspension pending a full investigation. The behavior displayed in the video does not reflect the values or training of our department, the chief stated, his words carefully measured. We are taking this incident very seriously. Robert scoffed. Taking it seriously now that it's gone viral and happened to a federal judge. Thomas turned away from the TV. They're in damage control mode. They'll sacrifice Daniels to protect the system that enabled him. At 1 o'clock, Thomas Mitchell stood before a sea of reporters and cameras on the steps of the federal courthouse. Dressed in his judicial robes, he presented a powerful image of dignity and authority, the same authority that Officer Daniels had tried to strip away the night before. I stand before you today not just as a federal judge, but as a citizen who experienced firsthand what too many in our community have faced, Thomas began, his voice steady and clear. Last night, I was detained without cause, handcuffed without resistance, and charged without evidence. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. What happened to me was not a misunderstanding or an isolated incident. Documents uncovered by investigative journalists show that the officer involved has a troubling history of similar conduct that has been systematically ignored or excused. Thomas paused, looking directly into the cameras. 3 weeks ago, in my courtroom, I was forced to overturn a conviction because this same officer had violated a citizen's constitutional rights. It now appears that my detention may have been an act of retaliation, a serious abuse of power that strikes at the heart of our justice system. Murmurs spread through the crowd. But this is not about me, Thomas continued. It's about every person who has been unfairly targeted, every complaint that has been buried, every officer who has turned a blind eye to misconduct by a colleague. It's about a system that has failed in its fundamental duty to provide equal justice under law. The courthouse steps had grown more crowded as Thomas spoke. Court employees, local attorneys, and ordinary citizens had gathered to listen. As a judge, I cannot and will not comment on pending investigations or potential legal proceedings related to last night's events. But I can announce that I am establishing a special judicial committee to review police conduct standards and accountability measures within our district. This announcement sent reporters scrambling to take notes. This committee will work independently but cooperatively with law enforcement agencies to examine how complaints are handled, how misconduct is addressed, and how we can better ensure that the power entrusted to police officers is never abused. As Thomas concluded his statement, the applause was immediate and thunderous. But perhaps more significant were the events unfolding across town at the police headquarters, where something unprecedented was happening. 3 police officers who had witnessed Thomas's processing the night before had come forward to Internal Affairs. They described how Officer Daniels had bragged earlier that day about teaching the judge a lesson, and how he had deliberately targeted Thomas's vehicle. Their testimonies directly contradicted Daniels' official report of the incident. By late afternoon, more officers had come forward with accounts of Daniels' past misconduct and the unofficial pressure to remain silent about fellow officers' actions. The blue wall was developing cracks as younger officers especially seemed unwilling to protect someone who would target a respected judge for personal revenge. Local news outlets were calling it a watershed moment. Social media buzzed with discussions about police accountability. Community organizers who had been advocating for reform for years suddenly found themselves with powerful new allies. And at the center of it all was Judge Thomas Mitchell, a man who had always believed in the system's capacity for justice, now finding himself in the unexpected position of catalyst for change. As evening fell, Thomas sat in his study again, reading through the flood of messages from people sharing their own experiences with police misconduct. Some had been carrying these stories for years, never believing they would be heard. Now, they had found a voice. Thomas understood that what had begun as a humiliating night in a holding cell was evolving into something much larger than himself. The revelation of Officer Daniels's history and motives had shocked many. But what would come next would truly transform the city's approach to justice and accountability. The conference room at the federal courthouse buzzed with tension. 1 week had passed since Judge Thomas Mitchell's detention, and the ripples had grown into waves. Thomas sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the newly formed Judicial Committee, 3 fellow judges, 2 law professors, and a retired police commissioner known for his reform efforts. "Let's begin," Thomas said, bringing the room to order. His voice carried the same authority it always had in his courtroom, perhaps even stronger now. The humiliation he'd experienced had not diminished him. It had focused him. In the past week, we've received over 300 statements from citizens detailing encounters with law enforcement, he continued, gesturing to the stacks of papers before them. Many describe patterns of behavior similar to what I experienced. Judge Eleanor Washington, a longtime colleague and friend, spoke up. The department's internal review has expanded beyond Officer Daniels. They're now examining the chain of command that repeatedly ignored complaints against him. Thomas nodded. And that's precisely why our work matters. This isn't about one officer. It's about a system that protected him. Across town at police headquarters, Chief Raymond Parker sat in his office, staring at the report before him. In 25 years of law enforcement, he'd never seen anything like the past week. 11 officers had now come forward with testimonies about departmental practices, breaking ranks in unprecedented numbers. The youngest, Officer Kevin Rodriguez, had submitted a detailed account of how new officers were taught to cover for their partners regardless of conduct. The unofficial training contradicted everything we learned at the academy, he'd written. Chief Parker rubbed his temples. The pressure was coming from all sides, the mayor's office, the media, community groups, and now from within his own ranks. The old playbook of delayed investigations and administrative leaves wouldn't work this time. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting. "Sir, they're ready for you in the press room." Parker gathered his notes and straightened his uniform. The announcement he was about to make would change the department forever, and likely end several careers, possibly including his own. Back at the Mitchell home, Lisa arrived to find her father's living room transformed into an informal command center. Thomas's brother William was fielding calls from national news outlets while Court Administrator Patricia organized meetings with various community leaders. "Dad," Lisa called, finding Thomas in the kitchen making sandwiches for everyone. "I just heard from my contact at the DA's office. They're convening a grand jury to consider criminal charges against Daniels." Thomas handed her a plate. "That's faster than expected." "It's not just the video anymore," Lisa explained, taking a bite. "They've uncovered evidence that Daniels altered his body camera settings that night, deliberately turning it off before approaching your car. That shows premeditation." Thomas absorbed this new information. "Have you seen the police press conference? It should be starting now." They moved to the living room, where William had already turned on the television. Chief Parker approached, the podium cameras flashing. "Good afternoon," Parker began, his usual confidence noticeably diminished. "Today marks a turning point for our department. After reviewing evidence related to Judge Mitchell's detention and conducting a broader internal investigation, I'm announcing several immediate actions." The room fell silent as reporters leaned forward. First, Officer Ryan Daniels has been terminated from the force, effective immediately. Evidence suggests his actions were not only unjustified but potentially criminal. We have turned all findings over to the district attorney's office. William whistled low. They're throwing him under the bus. Second, Parker continued, I have accepted the resignations of Deputy Chief Howard and Captain Reynolds, who oversaw Officer Daniels and failed to address numerous complaints about his conduct. Thomas and Lisa exchanged glances. This went beyond the usual damage control. Finally, I am announcing the formation of a new civilian oversight board with real authority to review officer conduct and recommend disciplinary action. This board will work in conjunction with Judge Mitchell's Judicial Committee to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community we serve. Chief Parker paused, then added something that wasn't in his prepared remarks. Personally, I want to apologize to Judge Mitchell and to every citizen who has been mistreated by officers under my command. The badge represents a promise to protect and serve with integrity. When that promise is broken, we must be held accountable. As the press conference ended, Thomas's phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. Judge Mitchell speaking, he answered. Judge, this is Officer Kevin Rodriguez. The voice sounded young, nervous. I was there that night when they brought you in. I didn't speak up then, and I've been ashamed ever since. Thomas moved to his study for privacy. I appreciate your call, Officer Rodriguez. That took courage. Sir, there's something you should know, Rodriguez continued. It wasn't just Daniels. There's a group within the department. They call themselves the Correction Committee. They target people who challenge them, especially in court. They've been doing it for years. Thomas felt a chill. Go on. They have a list. Judges, lawyers, community activists who've spoken out against police misconduct. They find ways to intimidate them. Traffic stops, parking tickets. Sometimes, worse. Daniels was part of it, but he's not the only one. Thomas took notes as Rodriguez shared names and incidents. When the call ended, he sat back processing the revelation. This wasn't just about his experience anymore. It was about a coordinated effort to undermine justice itself. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The protests that had started after his detention had evolved into organized rallies for police reform. A small group of supporters cheered as he walked up the steps, many holding signs with his now famous quote, "Equal justice under law, for everyone." Thomas nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't stop. His focus was on the meeting scheduled in his chambers, a meeting that would bring together unlikely allies in the pursuit of real change. By 9 o'clock, his chambers were filled with an unprecedented gathering: the newly appointed acting chief of police, the district attorney, the head of the police officers union, representatives from community organizations, and Officer Rodriguez. Thank you all for coming, Thomas began. We're here because we share a common goal, a justice system that works fairly for everyone. The tension in the room was palpable. These groups had often been adversaries, not allies. Yesterday, I received information about a group within the police department that has been systematically targeting those who challenge officer misconduct, Thomas continued. I believe this revelation offers us an opportunity, not just to remove bad actors, but to rebuild our institutions on a foundation of transparency and accountability. For the next 3 hours, they talked, really talked. Old grievances were aired, defensive postures gradually relaxed, and common ground began to emerge. The acting chief admitted what many had long suspected. The department's culture protected officers at the expense of truth. We called it loyalty, he said, but too often it was just covering up wrongdoing. Community representatives described how police interactions often felt like occupations rather than protection. Our young people grow up fearing those who should be keeping them safe, one pastor explained. Officer Rodriguez spoke about the impossible position of good officers trapped in a broken system. We joined to make a difference, but then we're told speaking up is betrayal. By noon, they had drafted a framework for reform that went beyond symbolic gestures. It included real accountability measures, community input on police training, and protections for officers who reported misconduct. As the meeting concluded, Thomas felt cautiously hopeful. The confrontation that had begun with flashing lights on a dark street was transforming into something powerful, a chance to address long, festering wounds and create lasting change. What no one in that room could have predicted was how this local, effort would soon capture national attention and inspire similar initiatives across the country. The transformation had begun, and its impact would extend far beyond what anyone had imagined. 6 months had passed since that fateful night when Judge Thomas Mitchell was handcuffed on the side of the road. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, trees around the courthouse displaying brilliant reds and golds. But the changes in the city went far deeper than the seasons. Thomas stood at the window of his chambers watching a training session taking place on the courthouse lawn. Police cadets and veteran officers sat side by side with community members, engaged in conversation rather than confrontation. The Community Dialogue Days had become a monthly event, one of many initiatives born from the crisis. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Patricia entered with a stack of newspapers and a coffee. "The verdict came in," she said, placing the papers on his desk. The headlines told the story. Former Officer Daniels convicted on multiple counts. After a 2-week trial, the jury had found Ryan Daniels guilty of official misconduct, filing false reports and civil rights violations. Thomas nodded but didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in seeing Daniels' downfall, only a sense that accountability had finally taken hold. "The other 3 officers?" Thomas asked. "Plea deals," Patricia replied. "They're cooperating with the ongoing investigation into the Correction Committee. Their testimonies have already led to 2 more arrests and several resignations." Thomas sighed. "Progress, then." "More than progress," Patricia countered. "Real change. Have you seen the new complaint statistics?" She handed him a report. Formal complaints against officers had actually increased in the past 6 months, not because of more misconduct, but because citizens now believed their voices would be heard. More significantly, over 80% of complaints had received thorough investigations, compared to less than 30% before. "The Oversight Board is working," Thomas observed. "So is your Judicial Committee," Patricia added. The new court guidelines for evaluating police testimony have been adopted by 3 neighboring counties. People are calling it the Mitchell Standard. Thomas shook his head, still uncomfortable with the attention. His personal ordeal had thrust him into a spotlight he never sought, making him a reluctant symbol of a movement larger than himself. His phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. "Turn on Channel 7. They're covering the academy graduation," Thomas picked up the remote and switched on the small TV in his office. The local news was broadcasting live from the police academy, where the first class trained under the new reform protocols was graduating. The camera panned across the diverse group of cadets standing at attention. The acting chief, now permanently appointed as chief, stepped to the podium. "Today marks not just your graduation, but the beginning of a new chapter in policing," he told the cadets. "You are the first class to complete our revised training program, with its emphasis on de-escalation, community engagement, and ethical decision-making." The camera cut to Officer Rodriguez, now promoted to training supervisor, as he led the cadets in a new oath, one that explicitly mentioned the duty to intervene if fellow officers exceeded their authority. Thomas switched off the TV, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The system was changing, perhaps not as quickly or completely as some hoped, but changing nonetheless. And it had taken his humiliation, broadcast to the world, to spark that change. Later that afternoon, Thomas presided, over his courtroom with the same calm authority he'd always shown. But something was different now. When officers testified, there was a new level of care in their statements, a consciousness that their words would be scrutinized not just for truth but for fairness. After court adjourned, Thomas met with a group of law students who had been observing the proceedings. They asked about his experience and the reforms that followed. "The most important change isn't in policies or procedures," he told them. "It's in expectations. We've raised our expectations of police officers, of the courts, of ourselves, and people tend to rise to the level of expectation placed upon them." One student raised her hand. "But sir, do you think these changes will last? History shows that reforms often fade when public attention moves on." It was a fair question, one Thomas had asked himself many times. "That's why we've built systems rather than just making statements," he replied. "The Civilian Oversight Board is now in our city charter. The new police training standards are codified in state law. The court guidelines for evaluating testimony are part of our formal procedures. He paused, then added, "But you're right to be concerned. Lasting change requires ongoing vigilance. That's where your generation comes in." After the students left, Thomas gathered his things and headed home. As he walked through the parking garage, he noticed a police cruiser parked nearby, an officer leaning against it. For a brief moment, his heart raced, a visceral reminder of that night 6 months ago. The officer straightened up. "Evening, Judge Mitchell." Thomas recognized him as one of the new graduates he'd seen on TV. "Good evening, officer." "Sir, I just wanted to say—" The young officer hesitated. "Your experience changed how we were trained. We studied your case, discussed what went wrong and how it should have been handled. I want you to know it made a difference to us." Thomas nodded, touched by the unexpected comment. "Thank you. That means a great deal." As he drove home, Thomas reflected on how extensively things had changed. The Mitchell Standard was being adopted by courts throughout the state. Police departments in other cities were sending representatives to learn about the oversight board model. National law enforcement organizations were inviting Thomas to speak about judicial perspectives on policing. What had begun as one man's humiliation had catalyzed a movement. At home, Thomas was surprised to find his living room filled with family and friends. Lisa had organized a small gathering to celebrate the 6-month anniversary of what they now called simply the night. "We thought it was worth marking," she explained. "Not because of what happened to you, but because of what you made happen afterward." Thomas looked around at the faces of those who had supported him through it all. His daughter, his brother, colleagues who had stood by him, community leaders who had joined his cause, even Officer Rodriguez and several other reform-minded officers. William raised his glass. "To my brother, who turned injustice into transformation." Thomas shook his head modestly. "I didn't do it alone. Change this meaningful never comes from one person." As the evening progressed, the conversation turned to next steps. The reforms had been significant, but there was still work to be done. The investigation into the correction committee was uncovering deeper problems. Training protocols were still being refined. Community trust, though improving, remained fragile in some neighborhoods. "We've made a good start," Thomas told the YAR group. "But it's just that, a start." Later, as guests were leaving, Thomas stepped outside onto his porch. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. He thought about driving home that night 6 months ago, how ordinary it had seemed, how unprepared he had been for what followed. One moment had changed everything, not just for him, but for an entire system that had needed changing for decades. A year earlier, Thomas might have believed that justice naturally prevailed in a system designed to deliver it. Now he understood that justice required vigilance, courage, and sometimes personal sacrifice. It required people willing to speak truth even when power pushed back. It required communities willing to demand better and leaders willing to listen. Most of all, it required believing that transformation was possible, even in systems that seemed resistant to change. As Thomas looked up at the stars, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not because the work was finished, it was far from that, but because it had genuinely begun. What happened that night had indeed shocked everyone, but what happened afterward would continue to inspire for years to come.